before I had polio, before I was in a wheelchair, I used to be afraid of people in wheelchairs. Didn't know any. I saw someone on the street in a wheelchair, I'd cross the street to avoid walking past them. And then one day I woke up and found myself in a wheelchair.
Hugh Gallagher is an author and biographer of such American political figures as Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Little did he know that when he contracted polio at the age of 19, he would go on to become one of the leading figures in the handicapped rights movement. As a very influential congressional staffer in 1968, Hugh Gallagher authored the Architectural Barriers Act that said any building built with federal funds should be accessible to the physically handicapped. But it wasn't until after his 14-year career working on Capitol Hill, in the Johnson White House, and as a successful lobbyist and businessman that Hugh Gallagher began to realize the full impact of polio on his life. That continuing process of coming to terms began as Hugh Gallagher sought to understand how FDR, his childhood hero and adult role model, had managed to maintain a public persona in which polio seemed to play virtually no role. This is the story of a man coming to terms with his disability in the face of his hero, FDR, who totally denied he was in any way different from anyone else.
Franklin Roosevelt, of course, was a hero for all us school kids. I had been born in 1932. Roosevelt had been elected in 1932. He was the only president we'd ever known, and he became, particularly during the war, more than president, but the very symbol of the war effort and of the Allied effort and of the nation. He was godlike to us little kids.
When Hugh was just 12 years old, he served as a page at the 1944 Democratic National Convention, where FDR was nominated for an unprecedented fourth term as President of the United States.
So I got a pass and a badge, and I could go down every day the convention was on. And my duties consisted of getting cups of coffee for people, but nevertheless, it was glamour. And my biggest memory of that convention is the nomination of Franklin Roosevelt. When his name was placed before the convention went wild, and we had a spontaneous demonstration, which was carefully orchestrated, of course, but we all had signs to carry, and mine actually said, "Don't change horses in midstream."
But as Hugh was later to conclude, Roosevelt was not the best role model for a disabled person. In 1952, as a 19-year-old student at Haverford College in Philadelphia, Hugh Gallagher came down with paralytic polio.
It started like a cold, and the cold got worse, and the cold didn't go away, and then it became unlike a cold. It became more and more painful in my back, in my central nervous cord, my neck. My neck was terribly stiff. There was no position that was comfortable. Standing, sitting, nothing. But I was determined I would not give up until my folks arrived, because they were coming up for the weekend, my mother, my father, and my sister.
Hugh had started at college at Haverford, and it was springtime, beautiful weather. They had a parents' weekend in May. And I was 15 at the time. I was a sophomore in high school, and Hugh came out to meet us. He did seem to be not the same Hugh somehow. He wasn't as lively as he usually was, and he seemed to be in some kind of pain. He was walking slowly.
And I went out to the car, and each step was just, impossible in terms of it would jar from the tip of your toe through every pain cell you can think of to the very tip of your brain. Got to the car and greeted them and said to my mother that I'd probably be all right in the morning, but I thought I really ought to go to the infirmary now.
We walked along with him, and he wanted to walk on the grass because the sidewalk was really hurting his feet, see? And that seemed really odd to me, that we had to walk on the grass, so we walked very slowly.
But I didn't know pain was associated with polio. So I lay there and watched, and as I was watching, the paralysis spread up my left leg. And when it got up to the whole leg, that leg wouldn't move. The only way I could move it would be with my right foot to tuck it under the left leg, move it, slide it back. So I thought this was kind of interesting. And I called the nurse and woke her up. And she came in, poor woman. She just panicked. She'd been at Haverford for 20 years and never had anything much more than a case of measles to deal with. And she called the doctor, and he called the ambulance, and he called my parents down, and my family down at the hotel. And Janet says that all three of them knew that I had polio, but that not one of them would say so to the other. So they rode out to the hospital in silence.
It seemed to be very hard to diagnose at first. So it was the middle of that next day, the Saturday, that they said, no, it was polio.
And from that moment, from then, for the next several days, life and death was a very near, very iffy kind of thing. Extremists, I asked for last rites and had them. I began, it's hard to say how it started, but I decided I can't take it in. That there's a limit to this. There's too much pain, and I'm just going to have to go where there isn't pain. And there developed, and it was very real indeed, a warm cave with a nice, cozy glow in it. And I was just outside the cave. And sometimes when the pain hurt so much, I could sort of cross over into the pain, into the cave. And I could sort of see myself down there, over there, suffering and stuff, and then I'd come back into my body. It was kind of it doesn't make much sense talking about it, but it was real. And I decided, okay, I'm going to hang on until my folks come. They were allowed to see me 15 minutes a day and to stand outside the room and talk through the window. And I remember there was a screen on the window, and that day it was raining. And so I hung on, and I thought, I just got to say goodbye. And so they came, and they said, you've been wonderful folks. And it was at that point that my mother started crying. And I'd never seen her cry before. And she said, "Oh, promise me you won't die today. Promise me that you'll be here when I come back tomorrow." So I said, "All right." Thinking maybe I could hang on another 24 hours. And I did. And she said, "Come on, one more day." And I did. And that's sort of how I got through the crisis.
After a year in the hospital, Hugh began his physical rehabilitation. The Gallagher family was able to get him into the Warm Springs Foundation in Georgia at that time the finest rehabilitation center for polio patients. It had been founded by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1920s and had been the location where he had fought his way back to health.
I was 18, I think. Hugh was 19. And what we did when we got there was that we formed a whole new world for ourselves. The great thing about Warm Springs, the great thing about what Roosevelt did was that he made it possible for people like us to come into this alien environment and feel wanted and needed and a part of it. And so with the new friends that I made from back then, Hugh was really one of the key people.
Warm Springs was an amazing place. It had been established by patients. FDR was a patient when he went down there, and he and other polio patients got together and said, we need rehabilitation, we know what we want, we're not getting it from the medical community, we're going to do it ourselves. And so they got an old ramshackle resort hotel with hot springs, pools, and they hired a doctor, and then they hired another doctor. They hired physical therapists. They taught the local blacksmith and local young men how to make braces. They designed braces. They designed functional equipment. They developed techniques for living.
Roosevelt was the god for us. He was the one who did it. From the simple fact that Warm Springs was paradise. If you've ever been there, if you ever go there, you'll see this exquisite campus with these wonderful buildings, with this sort of genteel air of beauty and good cooking and lots of people to help you. It was like going to this absolutely super home that this guy happened to build, just happened to have 20 doctors and 40 nurses and 200 orderlies, right? But it was this wonderful, exquisite environment that Roosevelt created for us. And it gave us pride. It gave, in this weird sort of way, it gave us pride in our disease, you know?
When you go to Warm Springs, you get the usual range of motion exercises and so forth. But you also got functional training. You were taught how to get in and out of the bathtub from a wheelchair, how to get in and out of the car using what muscles you have, how to dress yourself, how to do the whole array, the whole spectrum of daily living. And not only that, when you went to Warm Springs, you got something else. You got the spirit and the sense of that things can be done.
Hugh left Warm Springs in December of 1953 after 9 months of rehabilitation. He had recovered the use of his arms and hands and had learned how to manage the basic essentials of functional living.
I could get myself dressed, I could get in and out of bed, I could use the toilet on my own. True, I had no muscles from about here down, and I never have. I have partial use of my shoulders, but fairly good strength in my arms and hands. I was awfully weak still. I came back and didn't know quite what to do. I wanted to go back to college. I was sure I had to finish my college. But that was not until September. My father was most helpful in that he called Congressman Aspinall from western Colorado, the district where our families has lived for so long. And Aspinall put me on the staff as a part-time employee in the afternoons. And I had the strength to work 2 hours a day. And my mother would drive me down, and I would work my 2 hours, and then I'd come home and lie down. I learned how, I finally got hand controls attached to my parents' car, and by lots of practice, I learned how to get my wheelchair in and out of the car myself. You know, not very well, but I could do it, and it gave me such a tremendous sense of independence. I could go to work by myself, and I didn't have to come home right away, and I wasn't attached to my mother. And so I worked my strength developed, and I got so I could work 4 hours a day. And I owe a lot to Congressman Aspinall. He was a great man. The big question was, where would I go back to college? Haverford had many steps. I drove up to Haverford with Lorenzo Milam, whom I'd met at Warm Springs and who had been at Yale before he had polio. I talked him into going to Haverford, and I was going to go back. Well, we drove up together, and it was just impossible. There were too many steps.
When Hugh tried to return to college, it was a matter of finding a school that was wheelchair accessible. He applied to over 40 colleges. 40 colleges said, no, we're not accessible.
By the Navajos during the period.
At the invitation of a family friend, Hugh decided to attend Claremont Men's College in Southern California. Claremont was wheelchair accessible since it was built on a ramp system. But ever since Hugh lived in England as a teenager, he wanted to attend Oxford University. So in his senior year, he applied for a Rhodes Scholarship.
I filled out the forms and wrote the essay and got the recommendations and all that sort of thing, and mailed my application. And after several weeks, lo and behold, the application came back with a little note attached to it. And the American Rhodes Scholarship Trust had decided that they were not capable of deciding what to do with my application. You'll remember that in Rhodes's will, setting up the scholarship program, he was looking for future leaders, and he said they should be fit in mind and body, and that they should have some athletic ability. Well, I had been a good swimmer before polio, and I thought that would probably count. But the American people didn't think so, and they sent it to the home trust back at the mother country. And so the Oxford Trust the Rhodes Trust, which is based at Oxford, had a special meeting on my application. They'd never received one from a handicapped person before. And rather than rule on it, they decided they would return it to me essentially unopened, unprocessed. So there I was, and that made me damn angry. And I decided I'd get to Oxford. Well, I looked around and I found something called the Marshall Fellowship, which had been set up a couple of years before by Winston Churchill in thanks for the Marshall Plan. There were only 12 of them granted each year, but I, right off the bat, applied for a Marshall, and by God, I got it.
After Hugh left Oxford, he wanted to get a job back on Capitol Hill. He wrote to every senator he could think of and was hired by Senator John Carroll from Colorado.
John Carroll was a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and this was the committee that had jurisdiction over the civil rights legislation of the era. Civil rights was the burning issue in Washington at the time. There were marches and picketing and an ever-rising national demand for a guarantee that all people could vote without being beat up or without being threatened or without paying poll tax and so forth. I handled all the staff work for the Judiciary Committee, and so I was deeply involved in the civil rights effort. Senator Carroll was defeated in '62. Senator Bartlett of Alaska came to me and asked me if I would be his legislative assistant. I said, does that mean I can go to Alaska? And he said, certainly, I'd want you to go to Alaska. So I signed up with Bob Bartlett and have never regretted it. Bob Bartlett became like a father to me. He was a remarkable man. He was the father of Alaska statehood. I used to campaign when the senator had heavy responsibilities in Washington, and his health was not of the best. So during ordinary campaigns, when he was not running, I would go up and tour the state and speak in his behalf. And I campaigned by helicopter and by airplane and by launch and by dog sled, and I went anywhere a politician would go. I was taken out to an oil platform in Cook Inlet. I went out in a little aluminum launch, and when we got there, the launch was going up and down, and there's a big oil platform and a ladder which people climb all the way up there, and it must be 8 stories tall. And they took a crane and they lowered a platform, pallet, and they put the wheelchair on top of the pallet, and then they roped it down, thank God, and a man got on with me, sort of steady things, and they just hoisted me up, you know, way up over the North Pacific and onto the deck of the oil platform. And at the end of the afternoon, they put me back on the pallet, but they were nowhere nearly as sober or responsible as they had been on the way up, because they got the pallet up and over, and then they began swinging it back and forth, and all the crew members up there were cheering and saying, "Whoa, here we go, oh," back and forth.
Hugh Gallagher's work on civil rights was helpful several years later when he became interested in accessibility for handicapped people. While working for Senator Bartlett, he conceived and drafted the Architectural Barriers Act. This law established for the first time the principle that any building built wholly or in part with federal funds should be made accessible to the physically handicapped.
This was a fairly revolutionary concept in that it was taking the disability issue and seeing it in the context of the disabled as a minority group in the civil rights mode. Traditionally, society and government has always viewed disabled people as being sick, as being chronic patients who never get well. But we of the disability rights movement say, hey, you know, we're a minority. We aren't sick. We're just disabled. And if you look at disability in this sense, you see all sorts of injustices and unthinking injustices throughout society, such as all these staircases, all these bathrooms that people in wheelchairs can't use. So I drafted up this language and used my experience working with the Civil Rights Voting Act under John Carroll as sort of precedent.
The Architectural Barrier Act of '68 is terribly important. After that time, the policy of the United States was to segregate disabled people, send them to special schools, put them in sheltered workshops or institutions, keep them home in the closet. And this was the first act that called for our integration into society. And it's terribly important that without the Architectural Barriers Act of '68, I don't think that we'd have had the Rehabilitation Act of '73, which gave us our civil rights, or the Education of All Handicapped Children's Act, which came in 1975, which called for the mainstreaming of disabled people or disabled children in schools. So it was revolutionary legislation, and it was done single-handedly by Hugh. It was opposed by the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, OMB, the presidency, even the rehabilitation establishment opposed it. But he passed it single-handedly, and he certainly has to be called the father of the disability rights movement.
Hugh Gallagher went on to work in the Johnson White House from 1967 through early 1968, coordinating legislation on international affairs and foreign trade. In the early 70s, while working in Washington for British Petroleum, Hugh Gallagher received a call from the Alaskan Crippled Children's Society. Civic leaders in Alaska had banded together to build a rehabilitation center. They asked Hugh if he would come to Anchorage and give the dedicating speech at the banquet commemorating the opening.
And I remember on the plane reading through the prepared text and thinking, this sounds like every other speech that's ever been given at such a ceremony. And I thought, these people are good and they've worked, they care, and I should do something honest. I said, why don't I tell them what it's like to be handicapped and why it's important that they have demonstrated their concern by building this facility. So I start out reading the prepared text, saying how wonderful it is to be here and how wonderful we all are, You are for raising all the money, and you for organizing in the state legislature. And I sort of said something like, you're all wonderful and I'm all wonderful, but that's not what I'm going to say. And I turned the speech over and I said, look, I've never really thought about my feelings. I have never really talked to anyone about my feelings, but let me try. So I started and I said, you know, being handicapped is a bother. There's steps and there are frustrations. I said, but the physical bother is not it. It's just the outward physical sign of inward hurt. It's the self-esteem that is involved. It's the self-esteem that is as shattered as the paralyzed limbs. And as I started to talk, I froze and I thought, I can't do this. And way high up in the sky, for a split second, a great black bird flapped its wings. And I'd never, you know, I heard it as clearly as I've ever heard anything. And I was right in this auditorium, all these people hanging on my words, and I had to go on. So I did. And I said, you know, it's not nice feeling a broken man. And it's not easy going out in public and having people stare at you and feel awkward around you, because it makes you realize how awkward you feel yourself. And after I was finished, I just looked at the audience, and there was a silence, and it seemed to go on forever. I mean, it went on for seconds, and I thought, oh God, you know, I've really messed this up. What are they? And then, you know, they burst into applause and gave me a standing ovation, and it went on and it went on, and they all, people didn't want to leave the hall, but you know, the last ones to leave were 3 or 4 handicapped people who came up to me, and they were so moved they just wanted to. They wanted to touch me. They just said, yes, yes, that's what it is.
That blackbird was going to haunt Hugh for the next several years. Career side, things were going well. He was a high-paid lobbyist with a fancy office, designer furniture, expense accounts, luxury cars, limousines when he traveled. Private life, he didn't have much.
I had expended all my energy, my every effort from morning till night, in maintaining this mask, this deception. I insisted that the world consider me as being fully equal and in every way capable as any fit person. I did not pay attention to my energy level. I just insisted that my body do what my mind said it should. I drove myself from morning till night. I lived in this house. I maintained it by myself. I had a dog. I took care of the dog. I went grocery shopping by myself. I entertained, bringing the caterer at the time I entertained, but I kept a full social calendar in the Washington sense of hitting cocktail parties at night, dinner parties, embassy parties, Capitol Hill. And I did it all from the wheelchair by myself. The effort was tremendous, and as I've since discovered, the fury that I had inside me was tremendous too, because I was cheating myself. I was having no life. I had just the facade of a life. And I became more and more depressed. I didn't know why, but became more and more difficult to continue this daily round.
We were taught to be supermen, right? We were going to, as part of our taking over the world, we were also going to take over our own weaknesses, our own bodies, and be supermen with them. And we drove ourselves as hard as we could for 20 years. And finally our bodies and our minds rebelled.
One 4th of July, back in 1974, Hugh came home from work for the weekend and didn't go back.
The weekend was over, and my assistant called and said, "Where are you?" And I said, "Well, I don't think I'll be in today." And then the next day, I called him and said, "Look, I don't think I'll be in for quite a while." What was happening, to be honest? I said, I was sitting in this chair, my great-grandfather's chair, and that damn blackbird had come down and was sitting right here. And then, for a while, he was sitting right on my shoulder so that I couldn't even move. I could not move. And I decided that this was no life. This was not the reason that I had struggled to get out of the iron lung, worked at Warm Springs. I mean, this wasn't a life worth living. So I decided to do something about it. I decided to figure out what was wrong. And one of the first things I had to figure out was how come FDR had such a successful, happy, fulfilled life, and I didn't. You know, was I that much weaker than FDR? Was there some flaw in my character that I couldn't do what he did? He'd been my role model, you know, from childhood. So I figured if I was going to understand me, I had to understand FDR.
Roosevelt was active politically over 50 years ago. In those days, disability was even more discriminated against than it is today. The idea of a severely handicapped person running for public office, let alone the presidency, was something that the common man or the average person just wouldn't understand.
He appeared at the 1924 convention. This was his first appearance after having had polio. And he appeared on crutches, and he gave a wonderful speech, the Happy Warrior speech, which electrified the stadium. But to advance from the back of the platform to the podium on his crutches was a very difficult, arduous, slow operation, and the audience could see him sweating and straining and concentrating all his attention upon walking, keeping his balance. Well, the convention loved him, of course, but he looked too crippled. And so he said, well, I'll come back in 4 years' time, and I'll be walking on my own steam. And so for 4 years, he worked at Warm Springs developing a technique. And it was a very interesting technique. He wore long leg braces. He would stand beside a very strong man. He was fortunate. He had 4 big strapping sons. And the sons did exercises, weights, and developed their arms so that the arm was as stable as a parallel bar. And the president would stand beside his son, and their arms would be interlinked. And son James said that sometimes the president would grab his arm with such strength that he would want to cry out in pain. And then with the other hand, the president would have a cane. And he would use this cane as a crutch. He would put all his weight, use it as a load bearing, extend his index finger down the length of the cane, and with the 2 supports, he was able to stand erect. And he trained his sons to smile and to look as though he was having a good time. And they would progress down an aisle or up to the podium fairly slowly, with him shifting his weight and swinging one leg forward and then the other, kind of a toddling walk. But all the while chatting with each other and looking as though they're having a good time, responding to people cheering, and it was a wonderful technique.
FDR was such a talented person and such a wonderful politician. He and his advisors realized that if he were to return to public life and pursue the presidency, he would have to practice what Hugh Gallagher calls in his book, splendid deception. Because most of the voters were really not aware of how handicapped the president really was. FDR never denied he had polio, but he always referred to himself as a cured cripple.
My mother saw Roosevelt in 1932, when he was campaigning in Denver, Colorado. He was appearing at the Brown Palace on the first floor balcony. Mother was in the lobby. She saw him walk to the podium, give his remarks, and walk away, sit down, and she was not aware he was handicapped. Yet she was really quite close to him. And I think, that's my theory, that this was not only deception on the part of the president, but it was kind of a national denial. The country was in Great Depression, economic depression. The country desperately wanted Roosevelt as its leader because he was so ebullient and so confident and so sure of his leadership. And he, in effect, said to the public, look, you won't have to worry about my handicap. It's not a problem. And the public said, right, it's not. And thus they just didn't, they ignored it. They pretended it wasn't there.
Hugh's father worked for the Council for State Government. He met the president on 2 occasions. Once, when Roosevelt handed him a diploma as a member of the first graduating class of the Maxwell School of Government. The second time was in the Oval Office.
Franklin Roosevelt was seated behind the desk in his work chair, great big work chair, and would stuck out his hand and says, how do you do? And everyone rushed across to shake his hand. And Father said his impression was that Roosevelt completely filled the room, that he had such a big leonine head, and it was so animated and so involved and so interested that no one ever thought about what his legs were about because you couldn't see them underneath the desk. And besides, Roosevelt was so much in control that everyone could just relax and feel that the situation was in charge, and Roosevelt was the man in charge.
One of the great perks of the presidency for FDR was the Secret Service, because wherever the president would go, the Secret Service would go before him to make sure everything was okay. For instance, if there were no level entrance to a building, the Secret Service would build one.
And upon occasion, the Secret Service built ramps not just up the stairs, but they would actually raise the entire level of a city block, so that all people coming into the church would drive up on this ramp and get out and walk in. And so the president would drive up on that level and walk in with assistance and not have to deal with stairs. I've been told that, he would make appearances, whistle stop, come down a ramp, and when he comes down a ramp walking, he walks sort of like a praying mantis or something. And you ask all that crowd afterwards, was the president disabled? And they'd say, oh, no, well, maybe a little limp and a little trouble walking, but no, nothing much. They just loved him so much. They had such an image of him that the reality of what they were seeing was not important.
The press adored Franklin Roosevelt. He had 2 press conferences a week. There were many photo opportunities. He understood what reporters needed, and he made sure they got it. They loved him, and they protected him.
The press photographers, if they saw a new photographer or someone who didn't understand the rules, taking a picture of the president being lifted into the car or some such thing, they'd jostle up against him and knock the camera out of his hand and ruin the shot. If the president saw anyone, even a tourist, taking a picture of him being lifted, he'd point it out, and the Secret Service would go over and take the camera, remove the film, hand the camera back to the person, get the person's address and name, take the film, have it developed, destroy the 1 or 2 negatives of the president being lifted, and return the developed photographs to the person with a little note of thanks. Now, of all the thousands of still photographs taken of Franklin Roosevelt in the 12 years he was president, there are only 2 known photographs of the president in a wheelchair, and yet he spent most of his time in a wheelchair.
It was part of Roosevelt's way of handling his own disability that he made it appear that he was really not very handicapped at all, not only to his family and his advisors, but to the media, the nation, and the Congress. One of the ways he did this was by denying it to himself.
He essentially would not talk about his disability, and apparently he would not even think about it. His mother said once that he had never discussed it with her. His wife said that he had never yet faced the fact that he was disabled. His children all have said that they never talked with him about it. One time in the 1932 campaign, a magazine did an article on the president having had polio and having gone through convalescence, and sent a questionnaire. And one of the questions was, do you use a wheelchair? And his answer was, no, only a small kitchen chair with wheels in my bedroom to assist me in the morning when I'm dressing for convenience. Well, in fact, this was a man who was paralyzed from his waist down, and who only means of getting about was by a wheelchair or by long leg braces and crutches and the assistance of a strong man. And so whenever I met anyone who had had any personal experience with FDR whenever I met anyone over the last 30 years, I would always ask, tell me, how did FDR manage the wheelchair? What did he think about his disability? Did it bother him any? How did he handle it?
While researching his book on Roosevelt, Hugh had the opportunity to have dinner with Rex Tugwell. Dr. Tugwell was a frequent companion of FDR and was in Roosevelt's kitchen cabinet, a small group of scholars who surrounded the president.
Tugwell was a very thoughtful, intelligent guy. And Tugwell insisted that it never bothered him at all. He never gave it a thought. And that impressed me a lot, because I thought, by God, Roosevelt must have been working hard to perform, to have an act that even with his closest advisors, even Grace Tully and Rex Tugwell, he was acting. I mean, because it is impossible for a paraplegic man not to be constantly aware of a situation, not to be constantly aware of the impact his presence has on others, not to be having a variety of thoughts and emotions that come along. Orson Welles, who was the outstanding actor in America in the 1930s, when he met FDR, FDR said, well, Orson, you and I are the two best actors in America. And I think he was right.
It's so enormously painful for somebody as proud and as strong as that to wake up one morning and find out that their body's not working, right? And how do you handle it? You handle it by denial. And all those people during all those years used Roosevelt's system of denying that he was not all there physically. And that's what Hugh did, and that's what I did. So when Hugh wrote that book, he wrote it for all of us who go through, I don't know, you know, there are 5 stages of death. I think there's 17 stages of being handicapped, right? And Hugh wrote the book on that. And the key part of that is denying the fact that you are in any way different than other people in the world. It's a very foolish denial, and it's a very painful denial. And that's what the book did. It told of that story of denial.
Roosevelt had no intimacy. He was alone behind that mask. He was not only acting for the world, he was acting for his children. He was acting for his wife. Well, that's a terrible burden to carry with you. And it's a burden no handicapped person should have to carry. When Roosevelt practiced this deception and put on the braces and pretended to be standing, he was maybe fooling the world, and he was maybe fooling himself to an extent. But what he was doing, in fact, was devaluing his own self the way he really was.
Roosevelt was never really able to come to terms with his physical condition. And it's Hugh Gallagher's belief that that failure to come to terms hastened his death. Roosevelt was president not only during peacetime, but during World War II. He was commander-in-chief of all the Allied forces, as well as America's own.
He had such responsibilities, but the last 18 months of his life, his strength began to fail him significantly. That strength that he'd worked 7 years at Warm Springs to build just evaporated. And again, he spoke to no one about this. And he began to slide into a depression. Well, you know, my big black bird, I know what it feels like, and you can just see it in the newsreels. You can see it in the accounts of the people who were around him. And then physical things began to go wrong. Things perhaps not entirely psychosomatic in origin, but things affected by psychological attitude. And essentially, he lived until peace was in sight and the United Nations was set up, and then he just gave up the ghost and died. Well, I'm not going to go that way.
For the vision to see our way clear, to see the way that leads to a better life for ourselves and for all our fellow men, to the achievement of his will to peace on earth.
The thesis is that when you've lost part of your body, it's hard on your mind, hard on your spirit, and you have to get some help. And it was a hard decision for both of us, I know, to make the decision that we were going to go and have somebody help us, right? We built this system of independence, and all of a sudden we were having to deal with our minds that wouldn't do what we told them to.
A couple of weeks ago, I went to a local elementary school to talk to a class of disabled children. And it was great fun. And it was great fun. And it was far more than fun. It was very meaningful for me. They were wonderful. They were beautiful. They were so alive and so young. They were 10, 11, and 12. They were just getting ready for teenage years. And I was able, I think, to kind of identify with them as an old disabled person. And they had so many questions, you know. They said, do you like being stared at when you go out in the street? And I said, no, I sure don't. And told them some various strategies that I use. And I told them about my friend Lorenzo, who, when a little kid comes up and stares at him in a supermarket, when the little kid's mother's not watching, Lorenzo makes a horrible face at the little kid. And there were a couple of guys over there in the corner, and they were sort of whispering to each other, and then one of them ventured forward and said, Mr. Gallagher, don't think we're rude, but we think you have a very old wheelchair, very old-fashioned wheelchair. And I guess I do. You know, when I visited the school, I was impressed by how important the concept of mainstreaming is to the disability rights movement, and indeed to the whole concept of civil rights. Well, the best thing about mainstreaming is what it does for the able-bodied children. They go to kindergarten, they go to nursery school, they go up through the grades, and they're disabled kids in their class. And those disabled kids they play with, and they compete with, and they call each other names, and they make best friends, and they begin to learn that disabled kids are just like any other kids.
My mother has always had a big role in Hugh's life, and in mine too, but I think there was a very special connection between them, which was intensified when Hugh first became ill, and she spent a great deal of time with him, and it meant a lot to her to try and to help him. And it's interesting that in the last year, then my mother became very sick. She got cancer, and she was eventually in a wheelchair also, like Hugh. And she used to say to me that now, finally, she could understand what it was like for Hugh to be in a chair, but she thought it must have been so awful. Here she was at the age of 79, suddenly really realizing what it was like to be in a wheelchair. And they used to visit together. I would go with both of them. I can remember going down the hall, sort of pushing both of them, and Hugh was trying to teach Mother to do wheelies. They used to do these tricks on their wheelchairs, and she would say, how come you can go faster than I can? They used to kind of compete in their wheelchairs, and they had a sort of special bond, I think, in those last months of her life.
I had polio 30 years ago. There's never been a day, never been an hour, never been a moment that I haven't thought about that and wrestled with the emotions, the anger, the loss, the grief, the emotions you have towards others. And clearly polio was the sort of central event of my life. I've known hundreds of polios now, and paraplegics. And I've talked to doctors about this also. And I've never met a one for whom polio and paralysis wasn't a central shaping event of his life and wasn't something that had to be dealt with and felt and worked with for the rest of your life.
It's like both of us now are going through the process of post-polio where we're losing strength, which is a bummer. I mean, that stinks, because when you get polio, the old theory was you were down and out for a month or 3 months or 6 months or 2 years, and you began to work your way up, right, to where you could do more things. You had more control over your body, and you had more control over the world and your universe, right? And then what happens is that you reach a plateau, and then in the last 10 or 15 years, for him and for me, we've watched a lot of that power disappear, and it's scary because we don't want to be back in a hospital bed again. We're scared of that.
I think that it's unfortunate to be handicapped. You should do what you can to be as able-bodied, as independent as possible. You should deal with these feelings you have and share them. You know, so you are angry and you are grieving. Well, talk about it and explain to the people you love that about your feelings. And you know, in due course, they become manageable. They're never over. You know, I'm going to be dragging this anger I have and these grief and the frustration with me, you know, wherever I go for as long as I live. But, you know, get on with your life. Come to terms. And I think that's maybe a way of saying it.